At first glance, this looks like a family tragedy ripped straight out of Shakespeare, a powerful father, a favored daughter, a dramatic confrontation behind closed doors in a Manhattan boardroom. Headlines scream betrayal, disloyalty, even cruelty. But if you stop looking at this like a soap opera and start looking at it like a balance sheet, the story changes completely because this isn't a moral drama, it's a financial one. What you're really watching is the moment a human being stopped being an asset and became a liability. In cold, unsentimental terms, this is what happens when the market decides someone is costing more than they're worth. Capital doesn't care about bloodlines, it doesn't care about legacy, and it certainly doesn't care that the name on the building once belonged to the most powerful man in the world. Strip away the emotion and the politics, and what's left is a brutally efficient system correcting what it sees as a problem. When revenues fall, lenders get nervous. When lenders get nervous, pressure follows. And when pressure reaches a certain point, someone has to go. This isn't about a daughter turning on her father. It's about a business trying to survive. It's about spreadsheets, risk models, and lenders who don't vote, don't chant, and don't forgive volatility. In this story, the villain isn't Ivanka Trump, and the hero isn't Donald Trump. The real power in the room is money. And money had already made its decision. To understand why this moment was inevitable, you have to understand what the Trump Organization actually is. Not the myth, not the television image, but the business underneath. For decades now, this company has not functioned primarily as a traditional real estate developer. It hasn't been about buying land, pouring concrete, and holding properties for the long term. The core product wasn't steel or glass. It was a name. The Trump Organization evolved into a licensing company. Developers around the world built the hotels, the towers, and the golf courses. Trump didn't supply the capital or take on most of the construction risk. He supplied the brand. In exchange, the company collected fees simply for allowing that name to sit on the front of the building. When the brand was aspirational, this was a near-perfect business model. High margins, low risk, massive reach. It's the same reason people pay more for a logo on their sneakers or their phone. The logo signals status, success, and belonging. For years, the Trump name did exactly that. But this model has a fatal weakness. When your entire business is built on perception, reputation isn't a side benefit. It's the whole product. There's nothing underneath to fall back on, no manufacturing base, no diversified engine, just goodwill. And when that goodwill turns negative, the model doesn't bend, it collapses. A licensing empire lives and dies by how the market feels about the name. Once the name stops opening doors, it starts closing them. And that's when a profitable brand quietly becomes a financial threat. When people hear the phrase toxic brand, they tend to think it's vague or emotional, something you argue about on cable news. But in the world of finance, toxicity is not a feeling, it's a metric. It shows up in numbers, forecasts, and risk models long before it ever shows up in headlines. In hospitality and real estate, brand damage becomes visible very quickly. Occupancy rates start slipping, not because rooms aren't nice, but because corporations don't want the headache. Conference planners avoid properties that could attract protests. International partners quietly look for exit clauses. Luxury travelers who prize comfort and predictability above all else choose another five-star option down the street. No drama, just a different booking. This is where toxicity becomes measurable. Revenue per available room declines. Licensing partners push back on fees. Properties in major cities underperform competitors with similar amenities but less political baggage. None of this happens overnight, but once it starts, it compounds. And here's the critical point most people miss. Controversy is only tolerated as long as it's profitable. Markets can live with noise. What they cannot live with is uncertainty. When controversy transforms into reputational risk, capital reacts fast. Lenders reassess, insurers raise eyebrows, investors ask whether the brand itself is now a liability. At that stage, the name on the building doesn't attract customers, it repels them. And because fixed costs don't fall just because demand does, margins get squeezed from both sides. The math stops working. This is why brand toxicity isn't a political insult. It's a warning light on the dashboard. And once it starts flashing, Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just makes the eventual correction far more brutal. Once brand damage shows up in the numbers, the real power enters the room, and it doesn't belong to the family. It belongs to the banks and the creditors. Real estate empires are not built on cash, they are built on leverage, borrowed money, rolled over again and again, year after year. And that makes lenders the true gatekeepers of survival. Banks don't care about loyalty, they care about risk models. When a borrower starts generating negative headlines, legal exposure, and public backlash, those risks get priced in immediately, interest rates rise, terms tighten, and in some cases, doors simply close. A bank would rather walk away from a profitable loan than explain to regulators or shareholders why it's tied to a reputational landmine. This is where the situation becomes existential. Real estate companies constantly rely on refinancing to stay alive. If lenders refuse to refinance, properties don't just underperform, they disappear. Buildings get seized, assets get liquidated, entire portfolios unravel. That's not punishment, that's math. And unlike voters or fans, lenders don't negotiate with emotion. They don't wait to see how the next election turns out. They respond to volatility by pulling back because uncertainty is the one thing financial institutions are trained to avoid at all costs. When banks start distancing themselves, it creates a silent crisis. Liquidity dries up, options vanish, pressure mounts behind closed doors, and at that point, the question inside the company stops being who's right and becomes who's too expensive to keep. In that equation, founders are not sacred. Patriarchs are not protected. There is only one priority: reassuring the people who control the capital, and whoever threatens that relationship becomes expendable. This is where everything converges at the most dangerous point in real estate: the debt wall. Unlike a personal mortgage, commercial real estate loans don't stretch quietly over 30 years. They come due in brutal chunks: 5 years, 10 years. And when that clock runs out, the entire balance hits at once. If you can't refinance, you don't negotiate. You lose the keys. Every major developer lives with this risk, but timing is everything. The Trump organization is staring at massive loan maturities at the worst possible moment. Interest rates are higher. Commercial real estate is already under pressure. Office vacancies are up, hospitality is uneven, and lenders are far more cautious than they were a decade ago. That alone would be challenging. But this isn't a normal refinancing environment. There's an added premium here, a Trump premium, and it's not positive. Banks don't just evaluate cash flow and property value, they evaluate headlines, legal exposure, political fallout. When lenders decide a borrower carries event risk, that risk becomes grounds to say no, even if the property itself is sound. And when refinancing dries up, a liquidity crisis follows fast. Cash becomes king, but debt is still due. This is how empires collapse quietly, not with bankruptcy headlines, but with one missed refinancing after another. Properties get cross-collateralized, meaning trouble in one place infects everything else. At that point, the math becomes unforgiving. The question is no longer whether the brand is controversial. The question is whether it can survive long enough to meet its obligations. When the answer starts leaning toward no, something drastic has to change. And in leveraged real estate, drastic usually means removing the source of fear before the wall is hit head-on. At this point in the story, it's tempting to frame Ivanka Trump as a daughter making a personal choice. That framing is comforting, but it's wrong. Inside a corporate crisis like this, she isn't acting as a child. She's acting as a fiduciary, and that distinction matters. A fiduciary doesn't have the luxury of sentiment. Their obligation is to protect the enterprise, the assets, and the future value of the estate. That means lenders, investors, employees, and long-term viability come before family dynamics. In moments of stress, fiduciary duty isn't about loyalty, it's about survival. Ivanka occupies a unique position. She understands the language of elite finance, the expectations of institutional capital, and the unspoken rules of corporate credibility. She also understands how close the organization is to losing access to the one thing it cannot function without: trust from banks. When that trust erodes, no amount of branding or bravado can replace it. Seen through that lens, her move isn't ideological and it isn't emotional, it's procedural. Identify the distressed asset, isolate the risk, signal stability to the market. That's how corporate turnarounds work, whether the CEO is a stranger or your own father. The brutal truth is this: if the Trump organization collapses under debt, legal exposure, and reputational damage, the inheritance disappears. The buildings go, the influence evaporates, everything that sustains power dissolves. Doing nothing would mean sinking with the ship, so the choice becomes stark. Protect the individual or protect the institution. In systems governed by capital, that choice is never really a choice at all. The system demands preservation of value, and it rewards whoever is willing to act accordingly, no matter the personal cost. One of the most uncomfortable truths in this story is also the simplest. Political popularity does not translate into luxury revenue. The audience that fuels a populist movement is not the same audience that sustains five-star hotels, premium golf resorts, or high-end licensing deals. Luxury real estate depends on a very specific customer: corporate executives, international travelers, global brands, and institutions that value discretion above all else. These clients are risk-averse. They don't want surprises. They don't want controversy attached to their events, their vacations, or their balance sheets. Stability is the product they're really buying. By fully merging the business with a polarizing political identity, the Trump brand fractured its own market. It gained intense loyalty from one side, but it alienated the exact demographic that keeps a luxury model profitable. The people buying red hats are not booking penthouse suites. The people chanting at rallies are not signing long-term licensing contracts in Manhattan, Dubai, or Vancouver. Politics can generate attention, but attention doesn't pay operating costs. Hotel staff still need to be paid, properties still need maintenance, debt still comes due on schedule. None of that changes because a brand has cultural relevance. In fact, the more political the brand became, the narrower its commercial appeal grew. What worked as a mobilizing force in elections worked as a repellent in elite markets. And that mismatch is fatal in a business built on perception. You can dominate headlines and still lose money. And in luxury real estate, losing money is the only vote that truly counts. On top of the brand damage and the debt pressure, there's another force quietly draining the company from the inside: legal exposure. Lawsuits, investigations, civil judgments, and ongoing trials aren't just public relations problems, they are a direct assault on cash flow. High-stakes legal defense doesn't cost thousands. It costs millions, month after month, with no guarantee of an endpoint. Every dollar spent on attorneys is a dollar not spent maintaining properties, servicing debt, or investing in stability. From a shareholder's perspective, this is dead money. It produces no return. It only exists to slow the bleeding. In any normal corporation, a CEO who forced the company to absorb that kind of personal legal expense would have been removed long ago. Over time, those costs compound. Banks notice, partners notice, credit committees start asking uncomfortable questions about sustainability. Even if properties remain operational, the margin for error disappears. There's no cushion left for a downturn, a missed quarter, or an unexpected refinancing hurdle. This is where personality cults collide with financial reality. Charisma doesn't cover legal bills, loyalty doesn't restore liquidity, and public defiance doesn't impress creditors. At some point, the numbers become impossible to ignore. The individual at the center of the storm stops being viewed as leadership and starts being viewed as an expense line that keeps growing. When that happens, removal isn't punishment. It's triage. The system isn't asking who deserves loyalty, it's asking what must be cut to keep the patient alive. There's a bitter irony at the center of this moment that's impossible to ignore. Donald Trump built an entire persona around being the ultimate boss, the man who decided who stayed and who went. "You're fired" wasn't just a catchphrase. It was a declaration of absolute authority. But capitalism has no patience for personalities, and it recognizes only one boss: the market. The market doesn't care about dominance, bravado, or past victories. It evaluates performance in real time. When value rises, it rewards you. When value falls, it disciplines you. And when someone becomes too costly to keep, even if they're famous, powerful, or foundational, the system responds the same way it always does. This isn't moral judgment, it's mechanics. You see the same logic at work in everyday life. Miss enough payments, and your credit score collapses. When your credit collapses, doors quietly close. You don't get the loan, you don't get the apartment, you don't get the job, no speeches, no appeals, just consequences. What's happening here is the corporate equivalent of that collapse. The Trump Organization's reputation, its reliability, its bankability deteriorated to the point where it triggered institutional reflexes. Risk committees pulled back, lenders lost confidence, partners lost patience, and once that process starts, it doesn't reverse itself through defiance. It accelerates. This is capitalism firing back, not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. The system that once amplified Trump's power is now applying the same cold logic it applies to everyone else. When the numbers stop working, authority evaporates, and the market never apologizes for it. When you strip this story down to its core, what's left isn't family drama, political loyalty, or personal betrayal. It's money. This entire saga only makes sense when you follow the capital, not the characters. Power doesn't live in speeches or headlines. It lives in balance sheets, loan agreements, and the quiet decisions made in conference rooms you'll never see. The Trump Organization didn't reach this moment because of one argument or one election. It arrived here because a business built almost entirely on perception lost the confidence of the people who finance perception. Once that confidence disappears, the rules change, the institution turns inward. Preservation replaces pride. Survival overrides sentiment. This is the uncomfortable truth of modern capitalism. It disciplines everyone. Workers feel it through layoffs and lost benefits. Companies feel it through collapsing credit and vanishing liquidity. And even billionaires feel it when their presence starts subtracting more value than it adds. No one is exempt. The scale is different, but the mechanism is the same. That's why this story matters beyond the Trump family. It reveals how fragile power really is when it's built on branding rather than fundamentals. The market giveth, and the market taketh away, without ceremony or apology. If you want to understand who truly runs the system, stop watching the personalities, stop arguing over motives, look at the incentives, look at the debt, look at who controls the money. Because in the end, money doesn't just reflect power, it enforces it